Je vais commencer dans la manière française très formelle. Mesdames et messieurs les représentants de l'Université, professeur Hosmer, Madame Plassart, mesdames et messieurs les représentants de l'Institut d'Amériques et du laboratoire de recherche Triangle, notamment Monsieur Richaume, mesdames et messieurs les chercheurs et les étudiants. Mesdames et messieurs, good afternoon. Welcome. It's a pleasure to be with you here today. The Institut d'Amériques and the U.S. Mission in France are longtime partners, and we're very happy to support the roundtable discussions at this biennial Congress. With renowned regional research centers such as LARA and Triangle, and the University of Lyon and the University of Lyon 3 and 2, which I understand is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. So congratulations for that. We are also celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright Commission this year, which is another very important organization in French-American relationships, which also supports the research and combined educational exchanges for our two countries. And it's a special honor to welcome Professor Brian Hosmer from Oklahoma State University, who is an international expert on Native Americans and Indigenous Studies in North America, as well as the head of the History Department at Oklahoma State University. He will be leading a discussion today on the recent landmark ruling of McGirt versus Oklahoma, which occurred in the U.S. Supreme Court, regarding the jurisdiction of tribal courts and federal judiciary. Having grown up in Arizona and Utah, and having a wife of Native American descent, these types of issues are of special interest to me, so I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. On a professional level, an important mission for the U.S. government is to support a more diverse and inclusive society, which is the bedrock for a strong democracy. One of the first actions of the current administration was to put into place the most diverse government in America's history to reflect the growing diversity of American culture. In their first 100 days in office, President Biden and Vice President Harris assembled nearly 1,500 diverse and highly qualified individuals to serve in the cabinet and other positions within the executive branch. These public servants represent minority groups across America that have been previously underrepresented at the highest levels of government. And among them is Deborah Ann Haaland, the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, who is the first Native American to ever serve as a cabinet-level secretary. So I'm very much looking forward to this presentation and the roundtable discussion on tribal sovereignty and legal jurisdiction, and we'll give the floor to our moderator, Madame Plassart, and Professor Hosmer. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you very much, Consul Johns, for being with us today. Bonjour à toutes, bonjour à tous. Je vais faire quelques remarques liminaires en français pour celles et ceux d'entre vous pour qui l'anglais n'est pas une évidence. Et ce que j'aimerais faire pour commencer, c'est remercier Brian Hosmer d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Brian, thank you very much for being here with us. Nous avons donc le plaisir et l'honneur d'accueillir Brian Hosmer, qui va nous parler aujourd'hui d'un arrêt de la Cour suprême, dont vous entendrez plus dans un instant. Donc un arrêt de la Cour suprême qui s'appelle McGirt. Et le thème de cette conférence est, le titre de cette conférence est « Nations indigènes, économies autochtones » et interaction entre souveraineté et bourse d'études. Quelques mots rapides sur le parcours de Brian Hosmer, qui a dirigé le centre d'études McNichol sur les Amérindiens à Chicago de 2002 à 2008. Avant de partir pour l'Oklahoma, celles et ceux d'entre vous qui ne savent pas où se situe l'Oklahoma visualiseront mieux si je vous dis que c'est au nord du Texas et au sud du Kansas. Et donc parti pour l'Oklahoma, où il a occupé la chaire d'histoire de l'Ouest états-unien à l'Université de Tulsa. avant de devenir en 2020 directeur du département d'histoire de l'Université de l'État de l'Oklahoma. Brian Hosmer est ethno-historien. Il travaille depuis plus de 20 ans sur le développement économique des sociétés amérindiennes et leur rapport à l'économie de marché. Il observe que les nations amérindiennes retirent un pouvoir politique accru de leurs succès entrepreneuriaux. La bibliographie de Brian vous donnera un aperçu de ce dont nous allons parler aujourd'hui. Brian est l'auteur de American Indians and the Marketplace, donc les Amérindiens et le marché, persistance et innovation chez les Menominees et les Metlakatlans entre 1870 et 1920. Il est le co-éditeur d'un ouvrage qui s'intitule Native Pathways, qu'on pourrait traduire approximativement par les chemins amérindiens, développement économique et culture amérindienne au XXe siècle. Un ouvrage sur l'héritage de Harry Truman, Native Americans and the Legacy of Harry S. Truman, les Amérindiens et l'héritage de Harry Truman. Et enfin, en 2013, un ouvrage en coédition intitulé Tribal Worlds, les mondes tribaux, au pluriel, études critiques sur la construction des nations amérindiennes. Et donc aujourd'hui, les questions qui vont animer la présentation de Brian Hosmer sont premièrement, qu'est-ce que l'arrêt de la Cour suprême des États-Unis McGirt versus Oklahoma en 2020. Qu'est-ce que cet arrêt? Et comment les universitaires et journalistes parlent-ils des activités économiques des Amérindiens? Pourquoi est-ce que les évaluations de ces journalistes et universitaires rendent imparfaitement compte de la participation amérindienne à l'économie capitaliste? Thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Plassart, for that warm welcome, and thank you, Consul Richard Johns, for those nice words as well, and I'm really flattered that you're here for this talk. And I want to thank all of you for inviting me to deliver a plenary before this Congress. I apologize that my plenary will be in English rather than French, my limitations coming through to you. These kinds of occasions, offering a plenary, don't come that frequently, and particularly at this latter phase of my career, I'm especially grateful. I'm, again, thankful to Professor Marie Plassart, whom I know from Oklahoma, for inviting me and supporting this journey, which followed an opportunity to speak with her students over Zoom several months ago, as well as Professor Olivier Richomme, Marianne Magnan, Gail Dacan from the U.S. Consulate in Lyon, and Mikhail Lopes for managing my many requests and questions. And thanks as well to Luis Camargo for assisting with slides. I really appreciate it. In fact, the most welcome message I think I've received in the last couple of weeks was when I put my slide deck in Dropbox and Luis told me it had arrived. Yay. So let me just begin, and I'm going to talk a little bit about McGirt, a lot about tribal enterprise. I'm going to speak as well about scholarship around this, the ways that scholars and the general public have thought about tribal enterprise in relationship to, let's say, indigenous authenticity, and perhaps offer some thoughts about how these various strains of thought inform one another. Begin with a vignette. On April 13th, 2022, the United States District Court for the Northern District in Oklahoma handed down a ruling in a case called Hooper versus City of Tulsa. Little noted at the time or even later, this decision supported the City of Tulsa's motion to dismiss a conviction for a speeding ticket issued and paid in 2018. Who cares about a speeding ticket? Well, the plaintiff, his name was Justin Hooper, argued that the City of Tulsa, which had assessed the $150 fine, lacked the authority to do so because he, Justin Hooper, is Creek, member of the Muskogee Creek Nation, and that traffic violation took place inside the Tulsa city limits, which is located within the boundaries of the Muskogee Creek Nation. You can see Muskogee on that map. and its relationship to Tulsa, which stands at the corners. Actually, Tulsa stands at the confluence of the Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, and Osage nations, so that's where it is. The Osage are not on there. This other slide will come into play a little bit later, but just as a preview, that's the Arkansas River in Tulsa. Tulsa's to the right. That big complex there is a shopping and entertainment district owned by and operated at great profit by the Muskogee Creek Nation. So this will come into play as we move. So anyway, Hooper. Grossly simplified, Hooper's position turned on an interpretation of pre-statehood congressional authorizations that governed the application of state law to Indian nations. And to him and his lawyers threw into question the authority of municipal courts over members of tribal nations. Now, it's important to note that this case, Hooper versus Tulsa, never would have happened, never would have taken place, but for the 2020 decision in McGirt versus Oklahoma. It relates directly to a Supreme Court decision, so it goes all the way down to paying a traffic fine. In McGirt versus Oklahoma, the United States Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Muskogee Creek Nation and that it argued for the unbroken sovereignty of their nation. You can advance the slide here. And that ruling was subsequently extended to the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole nations, the four other of the so-termed five civilized tribes, which is an archaic designation for native peoples who were forcibly removed from the American South to what became Oklahoma in the 1830s and 1840s. From there, McGirt's ruling, this ruling that in favor of unbroken sovereignty of Indian nations, extended to northeastern Oklahoma, as the Quapaw Reservation was determined to have remained intact. And just a month ago, an Oklahoma court ruled that the Peoria and Ottawa reservations had also never been erased. Still around. McGirt, let me see if there's a next slide here I want to go. Yeah, okay, this gives you some sense of where we are. I'm going to do a couple of them here. Just gives you a little bit of a... Okay. The McGirt decision was a blockbuster. This gives you some sense of the background for this. In that the United States Supreme Court, as I mentioned, endorsed Muskogee Creek jurisdiction over criminal cases involving a citizen of a tribal nation when that crime took place on tribal territory. In rendering this ruling, the court affirmed constitutional principle that only the United States Congress could erase tribal sovereignty where it had been recognized through treaty or other mechanisms, and had to do, critically, had to do this, make the change directly and specifically through legislative action. This position, the Creek's position, you can see some of the quotes here speak to this, countered the state of Oklahoma's contention that the accumulated effects of colonialism, the accumulated effects of history, the accumulated effects of dispossession, land loss, had effectively erased the Muskogee Creek Reservation, absent any kind of a correct congressional authority. So their argument was, regardless of what Congress did, the operations of colonialism, the operations of history had effectively erased the reservation, no matter, the previous assertions. The Supreme Court rejected the state's argument. And in fact, in doing so, and here's one of the points to this slide, hewed closely to the law, closely to the Constitution, even as the decision came as a shock to many white Oklahomans. McGirt referenced the force of history, as Justice Gorsuch wrote in his memorable opening lines to McGirt, on the far end of the Trail of Tears, there was a promise. And that promise was abiding by the rule of law, where the government negotiated and ratified treaties, and that those agreements meant something. and they couldn't simply be erased by informal action or even state-level policy action. So I've offered a few slides, and I'm going to do these myself and then come back to you, that gives you maybe, we can come back to something, some sense of the complexity of this sort of set of conversations. So, whoops, let me go back. Whoops, I'm going to go back. How do I go back? Okay, I just did. Okay, so this is, there we go. And so we have, right, prior slide gives you a sense of the removal. Can you go back one? There you go. This is post-removal. And you see the tribal territories after the removal. And then after the Civil War, treaties are renegotiated, but the 5 tribes remain. By the end of the 19th century, you have this patchwork of Indian nations that defines Oklahoma. Prior to statehood in 1907, statehood, according to non-Indians, erases all of that, except for the individuals who may have some tribal and Indian heritage. But those boundaries become moot points at the point of statehood. This gives you a sense of how allotment worked, and allotment is the subdivision of tribally held lands. It was one of these instruments for dispossession. So beginning in 1887, policy moved toward creating essentially homesteads out of collectively held land. And then you can see this map, and it's deliberately complicated, right? And it shows you who owns which, but it gives you a sense of what the Creek Nation ends up looking like at the end of the 19th century, this hodgepodge of different kinds of land. So we can come back to some of these things if we want. Oops. Where am I going? Advance one? Okay. So I wanted to, as I say, offer some explanation, and we can come back to that, but I don't think we will need to. But I want you right now to absorb the fact that the United States Supreme Court in McGirt versus Oklahoma determined that for a century following statehood, the state of Oklahoma had illegally and unconstitutionally appropriated federally recognized and protected sovereignty over Indian nations, at least when it came to criminal cases. Illegally and unconstitutionally absorbed these prerogatives. So last minute thing about Hooper, he ends up being a good way to start the talk, and then ultimately he's going to go away. What's interesting about this is how Hooper's attorneys sought to extend the McGirt ruling from criminal jurisdiction to municipal jurisdiction, making it bigger, pushing on that principle. The court in this case disagreed and ruled that McGirt makes no mention of McGirt municipal jurisdiction and doesn't deal with municipal law at all. So he lost. So who cares? I find this interesting for its context because it is enwrapped or it is intertwined with predictably fevered reception from state political leaders, city leaders, business and commercial interests, journalists, whenever the McGirt ruling comes up. Separately or in concert, politicians and media personalities and business interests fan the flames of paranoia and fear, telling Oklahomans that if left unaddressed, the McGirt ruling will lead to violent criminals roaming the street with impunity, personal property confiscated by unaccountable tribal authorities, and leading to the reduction of non-Indian Oklahomans to a kind of second-class citizenship. And when one thinks about that phrase, you realize irony, right, is truly dead in a place like Oklahoma, because there certainly were second and third and fourth class citizens, but not the people who were complaining about it this time. Our governor, as you can see here, is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, a claim the tribe contests, by the way. And he's a leading purveyor of these delusions, these ideas, which are regularly amplified in news reports and op-eds, letters to media outlets, and the like. The governor's toxic political commercials in 2022 raised the specter of nefarious casino bosses, referring to tribal gaming enterprises, casino bosses seeking to undermine his principled leadership. And in this sense, those arguments reference, and this is one of the points I want to emphasize, very old arguments about corrupt Indian governments mismanaging public funds, ignorant Indians easy prey for criminals and even mafiosos. While Governor Stitt postures, next slide, himself as an everyman committed to equal rights for all Oklahomans, as opposed to special rights for tribal nations, I gather, nations have proven to be resourceful, sophisticated, and powerful adversaries, equally adept at defining their positions in broadly universal terms. As an example, next slide. When in May of 2020, the governor pushed through a renegotiation of tribal contracts, gaming contracts, the tribal leaders responded forcefully and publicly. Let me offer a little explanatory note why it's a big deal. Gambling establishments in tribal nations in the United States are governed by constitutional precedent and legislation. One piece of legislation is the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act of 1988. Native casinos, tribal casinos, exist solely as a function of tribal sovereignty. They're not individual businesses. They are tribal businesses that exist as a consequence, a part of tribal sovereignty, and are dependent utterly on their location on tribal lands that are held in trust by the federal government. So the constitutional position of the tribes and the land is instrumental in the existence of casinos. The Indian Gaming Regulatory Act requires gaming tribes and the state to enter into negotiations, not about whether gaming will exist, but in some sense on the conditions. And the exchange of money, the various other maybe law enforcement issues, the terms of the contract. So these are larger compacts. Both sides are, at least in theory, required to enter into these conversations in good faith. They're supposed to be good faith negotiations. That, over the course of time, has become complicated. And in Oklahoma, in 2020, the governor decided that he would not enter into negotiations with the tribes over renewing their compacts. And at the same time, he went to two small tribes that had very little in the way of gaming enterprises and told them, I will negotiate with you. It was an effort to pit the nations against one another and as a way to extort a better deal from the large gaming tribes like the Creeks, like the Cherokees. So it was a transparent effort to really shake down the tribes. What's interesting about this is that in this case, the governor lost. Principal Chief Chuck Hoskins of the Cherokee Nation, here's the reference, objected strenuously and publicly denounced the governor of Oklahoma and the Interior Department for this intrusion in tribal sovereignty. No federal official, Hoskins said, can give Governor Stitt the authority he needed to legally bind the state to these compacts. And he argued that the result would be months and years of litigation in favor. So there's a pushback. As importantly, next slide, a consolidated effort by United for Oklahoma, representing numerous Oklahoma tribal nations, entered the public discussion through commercials and public service ads. Slickly done, I would add, through a series of television, print, social media spots, largely funded through gaming profits. United for Oklahoma sought to educate the general public to the tangible benefits brought by tribal enterprise and, by extension, tribal sovereignty. This campaign stressed the nation's commitment to the general welfare and advancement of the state for all Oklahomans. All Oklahomans. United for Oklahoma positioned themselves as the responsible governments for all Oklahomans. This was a really big moment, a really impressive moment. The impasse left millions of revenues already factored into state budgets, languishing in escrow accounts, as the governor does, as all of a sudden there's this money that's sitting there that the state can't collect. the dimensions of the struggle became apparent to everybody. And with this, a clear indication of a shifting balance of power, even in a risky moment. To the governor's surprise, federal courts supported the law, supported the tribes, and delivered them a victory in this latest high-stakes battle. They won. The governor was humiliated. As an interesting side note, one other piece about tribes engaging in public affairs and in politics. In 2022, the large tribes, Cherokees, Muskogee Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, others, broke with tradition by endorsing a candidate for statewide political office. They endorsed Governor Stitt's opponent, who lost. Now, one might think that that would have been a high-risk proposition and that having done so, the tribes would have to retreat. No. They endorsed her. She lost. They move on. So again, sort of a demonstration of a growing confidence, a growing kind of political impact that the tribes were willing to take a risk, knowing they would probably lose, and keep moving. It speaks to a different balance of power. So my goal as we move forward, and I won't keep you too long, I hope, is to not so much analyze McGirt itself, but I want to consider the evolving status and influence of tribal nations, placed next to scholarship about indigenous economic development, these two kinds of things. I will suggest that external assessments of indigenous enterprise and economic culture influence how non-Indian scholars, observers, politicians evaluate the structure of tribal economies, and consider indigenous peoples as economic actors, actors in their environments. This is a complicated conversation, deeply rooted in ideas about relationships between culture and economy that often marginalize indigenous histories and essentialize native cultures. And they often reproduce an old binary of defining human and political economy as either universal and irrespective of cultural values, or heterogeneous, varied, conditioned by cultural values. Right? Is there one mode of economic thinking, or are there many that are related to cultures? Is economic behavior largely similar across all human communities, or as diverse as the human condition generally? And then what does that mean as we move? That's fine. We can go. That indigenous peoples are subjects of and actors of in this unfolding of their lives and economies is another goal of this paper. And what particularly interests me here are those relationships between tribes in Oklahoma that illustrate how tribal financial muscle can translate to political power. Here I have, you can flip through a couple of things. Let's see what we have here. Let's go back. Let's not do that right now in the interest of time. Keep moving forward. So these are a couple of slides that I can come back to that establish sort of the constitutional position of tribal sovereignty. And I don't want to spend a lot of time, but we can come back, and these are deeply rooted in history that in constitutional precedent having to do with the trust doctrine, treaties, and so on. Go to the next one. Places tribes are under federal authority. Native peoples are not given lands or rights by the United States. So oftentimes the suggestion is the tribes are given reservations. No. Instead, tribal leaders in past generations reserved the lands and rights they already possessed when engaging in treaty negotiations with the United States, which often involves selling or exchanging. And in 1905, germane to this conversation, the Supreme Court ruled the treaty was not of grants of rights to Indians, but a grant of rights from them, a reservation of those rights granted. So we can keep going. Okay, move through this. Okay, so nearly 3 decades ago, my advisor and first mentor, his name was Jack Sunder, handed me a pirated copy of Rolfe Knight's Indians at Work, an informal history of native labor in British Columbia, 1858 to 1930. It was published in 1978, forgotten soon thereafter, but ultimately became a cornerstone for a new scholarship that overturned existing narratives that had largely ignored native laboring and native engagements with non-Indian economies. Indeed, scholarly convention at that time amplified more general ideas and perceptions about indigenous political economy as invariably collapsing under the weight of colonialism, the expropriation of resources and land, and ultimately the marginalization and replacement of indigenous peoples. While I've worked with those ideas for several decades, I'm newly inspired by many critiques of our current neoliberal consensus that emerged following the 2008-2009 financial crisis and reappeared even more vibrantly during the global pandemic. This scholarship is well known to you. Thomas Piketty's masterful works, as well as a whole raft of popular titles that I've been immersing myself, then engage with poverty and inequality, the role of global finance, the rise of extremism, suppression of critiques of capitalism, perhaps even implicating a neoliberal order supporting liberal democracies. This whole, right, there's this whole milieu, right, of things that are going on right now, which have caused me to kind of re-engage some old ideas about that I'd thought about a number of years ago. Significantly, next one, germane to the purpose of this paper is what happens on the ground and what happens in real life. And these examinations of capitalism and poverty overlap in time with mass protests that for a brief time implicated neoliberalism and broader social justice conversations. Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, No Doppel, the rest. And in the U.S. led to some exploration of policies and practices aimed at mending the economic and social fabric, things that are still kind of ongoing. Still another thread, keep going, and I want to say, so you probably will recognize some of these, right? So this is part of a global conversation. I like to put those slides next to each other, right? This is kind of, there it is, right? And another thread, move to the next one, new histories of capitalism draw upon the moment as well. Led by the scholars that I've represented here, these recent studies move to reframe the reference of capitalism from the metropolis to the hinterlands, centering on the role of commodities to the development of global capitalism. And these studies have us consider how capitalist regimes articulate rules and laws that support expropriation and privatization, ensuring the accumulation of capital, that's good, yeah, leave it there, and the regularization of markets. And this yields to a general contention that capitalism, back to the previous slide, depends upon the state, and the state comes to depend on capitalism. In principle, these basic ideas hold great explanatory power for indigenous engagements with the global West and their economic systems, or at least they might. Next slide. The most recent generation of scholarship, some of which are represented here, just a small number, pushes back against assumptions about indigenous communities and cultures trapped in what Colleen O'Neill identified as a traditional modern dichotomy which positioned indigenous values and culture as communal and cooperative as contrasted with the individualistic and competitive values associated with Western societies and their political economies. This thread emphasized agency and adaptation over, or at least balancing, operations of differential power. At the same time, settler colonial studies center expropriation and marginalization, tracing both the production of poverty and the cultural discourses that support it to the replacement of indigenous populations with settlers and so on. Recently, Cherokee, next one. Oh, go back. Yeah, there's another one. That's fine. Keep going forward. So recently, when I mentioned this book, just really quickly and then move to the next kind of piece of this. This conversation about expropriation on the one hand and agency on the other really interweaves through a lot of the work on indigenous economic development, and it's a kind of tension, I would argue, that continues to shape these conversations. Cherokee scholar Courtney Lewis, who's referenced here, links assessments of capitalism with indigenous enterprise by redefining economic sovereignty as a specific form of indigenous self-determination, where indigenous entrepreneurship is distinctive because of its indigenous context, not community service or product design. So if we think about it, indigenous economic activity is sometimes associated with the product itself, craft work, right? Art. And that's sort of assumed to be the nature of indigenous economics, or the use of businesses to provide social services for communities. That's assumed to be it. Her argument is that those aren't the defining characteristics of sovereign entrepreneurship. Sovereign entrepreneurship is the indigenous context itself, that it happens in that environment, right, in an indigenous environment, and the products are something outside that and beyond that. This is, I think, a really interesting question, because at the same time, Lewis also has us consider economic hegemony, the use of economic manipulations by the state to politically subjugate a country or a people. So there's both of this, right? There's agency and then there's power. Next slide. Over these same, you've seen this before, but I want to reference it again. So as that scholarly conversation is taking place, it tracks. It happens at the same time as Indian economies, tribal economies, have expanded dramatically. And this is really, I think, an important thing to keep in mind, the context for this. According to this study, here again, these are striking figures. Tribal enterprise injected nearly $16 billion into the state economy. It generated more, right, than 113,000 jobs. $5.4 billion, dollars in wages and investments. What is more, the direct return to state coffers, state government, by virtue of those gaming compacts that I mentioned a little while ago, reaches into the hundreds of millions of dollars. So the tribes contribute portions of their gross revenues to the state in exchange for those compacts. It sounds like taxation, but it isn't taxation, because it's illegal for the states to tax the tribes, but this is the kind of workaround. So the tribes, right, generate revenue for their own communities, but also send it back to the state. And this is particularly important in light of the earlier conversation I was having, because as the tribes have generated and sent that money to the state government itself has engaged in more than a decade of tax cuts. So the state government has cut particularly state income taxes and business taxes at the same time, right, that the tribe has sent more and more money to the state, which means that the tribes subsidize those tax cuts. They maintain, right, fiscal sovereignty of the state, or the fiscal health of the state. Next slide. At the same time, the nations are builders of infrastructure, roads and bridges, schools and entertainment districts, like this vibrant Riverwalk complex. I've attached a few things here that speak to this whole thing. This was a bankrupt business venture, a business venture that was owned by the city of Jenks, which is across the river from Tulsa. The Creeks purchased it for $11.5 million. That was a fire sale price, the whole thing. And then they invested in it and transformed this moribund business district into a thriving entertainment restaurant, right, district. I remember at the time, just to give you a sense of the sort of the way irony works or doesn't work, that when the Creeks made this purchase back in 2012, one of the newspaper editorials that I read said, "Good, we're so happy the Indians have purchased this complex because Indians know how to run businesses." Think about that, right? In the context of stereotypes about using money and business, and they said, good, we have people who know how to run businesses running this business. Next slide. The Chickasaw Nation funded in large measure the AAA baseball park in Oklahoma City, Chickasaw Bricktown Ballpark. Next one. The Chickasaw Nation saw to completion the First Americans Museum in Oklahoma City, which is a fabulous museum, and they did it after the state reneged on its agreement to fund that museum. The state pulled out of it, citing fiscal problems. The Chickasaw Nation moved in and funded this. Next slide. And it now has added to that, where they're building a resort complex next to it. So these are the kinds of things that the tribes are doing. Tribes run state parks. You can keep going. Tribes own state parks, some of which have been shifted from the state to the nations for upkeep and maintenance, while ironically, the governor is embroiled in a controversy about a sweetheart deal with a shady restaurant concern to manage those facilities. Now, I'm not running against Governor Stitt. He's a convenient foil in this paper. So that's it. Next slide doesn't even begin to consider the multiple and multiplying benefits generated by tribally run healthcare and housing, social assistance, daycare, athletics, as the nations deliver social services as fully functioning government. This Council Oak Comprehensive Healthcare, and these are members of the Creek Nation in the audience here, was formerly a privately run cancer hospital that went bankrupt. The Creeks purchased it and now have made it a fully functioning hospital available not just to Creek citizens, but Oklahomans as well. This larger profile. So I'm going to run through a few things here, but what I want to say here, right, is that tribes are building their own economic capacity by diversifying their enterprises. In many cases, gaming generates investment capital for other purposes. And so you can start running through some of these next set of slides. You get a sense of what I'm talking about. Native artists, keep going. Miami tribe through a diverse portfolio. This is the Miami Nation Enterprises, diverse portfolio of companies. Keep going. Native American tribally owned business, Wichita Tribal Enterprises. Keep going. Oklahoma Tribal Finance Corporation. When tribes work together, we strengthen economic development. Next. Educate, empower, engage. The American Indian Chamber of Commerce of Oklahoma. Keep going. Banking and finance. First National Bank and Trust Company owned by Native communities. Keep going. Tribune, another newspaper, keep going. And they also run media enterprises. OCO, back one. OCO is Cherokee Nation set of television programs, and they have a set of episodes. They're fantastic. They've won Emmy Awards. And so they have this media presence as well, and OCO is on regular television. There'll be a segment weekly, and they're really fantastic, and they're about everything. They're about, craftspeople and old age homes and exciting sports teams and you name it. Okay, let's keep going. So none of this appeared out of nowhere. So this is what's happening now. Or even was necessarily related to the onset of gaming. In the 1980s and the 1990s, journalists and lawyers and bankers and policymakers began observing tribal enterprise back then. Among these, a 1986 article focusing on how tribes in Maine leveraged their land claim settlement to finance business enterprises and investments. Dragon Cement, Shape cassette tapes, but when they still made cassette tapes. A blueberry farm. And this is just something out of the New York Times from 1988 when the tribe, the Passamaquoddies, purchased a defunct cement plant and sold it at a profit. So this is in the 80s. This is before gaming. Next slide. An interesting book entitled Tribal Assets, which was written by a journalist by the name of Robert White. Next one. And an interesting edition of the publication of Phi Alpha Phi Honorary Society, of all things. It traces the development of tribal enterprises in the context of the Reagan administration's efforts to contract federal programs for Native peoples. As a point of reference, the Bureau of Indian Affairs suffered the largest percentage budget cut of any agency during the Reagan administration, the largest single percentage. And the Reagan administration decided to do that, or explained it or justified it by saying that they wanted to unleash the entrepreneurial potential in Indian communities. And that's how this was sort of the cover for this. We're going to take all this money away, but we're going to encourage you to create your own businesses. Next slide. Oh, I thought I had another one in there. Back one. Oh, okay, that's fine. It doesn't matter. I mean, it was kind of referencing the sort of tribe's complex relationship with the Reagan administration at that time. That on the one hand, they welcomed the opportunity, right, to engage in sort of more local business, and Reagan affirmed the federal government's commitment to a nation-to-nation relationship. But at the same time, James Watt, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush repeatedly referenced Native communities as examples of failed socialism, of failed communism. This is during the Cold War, and they would repeatedly say, if you want to see an example of the failures of socialism, go to an Indian reservation. So there's this, this contrast, right? This tension in here, but they both revolve around the Reagan administration's ideological positioning and how they saw tribes might in fact fit into these. This is interesting in the moment because these accounts that I'm describing spoke a lot about tribally sponsored entrepreneurial activities, like an automotive wiring harness enterprise in Mississippi, the Mississippi Choctaws. They also defined, and here's sort of the piece that I'm happy to explain more in a little bit. I hope it's not too in the weeds. They also defined tribal assets, the assets that the tribes held, as including their constitutional position, their trust status, their position as under federal authority and exempt from state and other business regulations. So some of this, right, is go ahead and, start some business. The other is let's take your sovereignty and let's leverage it, right? Let's leverage your sovereignty into a way to generate capital. So there's a complex moment. The idea, right, that trust status, constitutional position, sovereignty were untapped potential, untapped business opportunity that imagined tribes as a variety of corporate entity. I'd also argue that they followed an old idea that underneath all of these cultural differences, in the heart of hearts of Native peoples beat, right, the vibrant heart of capitalism, right? That underneath and released from the shackles of the reservation, released from the shackles of trust status, they're capitalists, right? There they are. And so this was part of this. There's, again, kind of a give and take. Equally interesting is a statement quoted in that book, Tribal Assets, I mentioned a little while ago, attributed to a Navajo gentleman. Responding to the journalist's question about the cultural implications of economic change, he said, traditional Navajo values don't include poverty. Really powerful. Really powerful. At the time I read this was in the 80s, I'm dating myself, it struck me as a critique of external characterizations of Indian values and potentials, right? Constructions placed upon people. An argument against culturalist presumptions. In recent years, it's that, but also perhaps again, there's sort of the more nefarious excursion into this emerging world of privatization, right? So this can be read in more than one way, and I think that's an important part. To these pieces here, Marjane Ambler's slide on mining and reservations. This again is from 1991. It's a discussion of reservation mining coupled an appreciation for the history of exploitation and environmental damage with a stout defense of the capacity of tribes to make decisions for themselves. Decrying journalistic excursions to Indian country in search of sad stories of the plight of impoverished Native Americans, still true today, Ambler emphasized the full humanity of tribal citizens and governments amidst that generalized discourse that treated them as children. Across the nation, she wrote, tribes gradually now are finding ways to make economic progress fit into their own value systems by rejecting the proposition, common among some non-Indians, that having jobs necessarily necessitates rejecting their culture. This discourse continues on into the gaming era. A generation ago's quote-unquote smart money, I'll be with you, how much? We okay? Okay. On Indian gaming advised tribes to see bingo and slots as investment capital. After all, critics said this new buffalo, right? This new buffalo could go the same way as the old buffalo, leaving indigenous people with immediate sustenance, but little for the longer term. Now, leaving aside the obvious omission in that conversation, namely the demise of the old buffalo had everything to do with the violence of settler colonialism, this image speaks to enduring ideas about tribal enterprises, indigenous cultural difference, assessments of native business and government acumen, ideas of cultural difference, and the precariousness of tribal sovereignty. Literary studies scholar Gerald Visner famously predicted backlash against gaming that would ultimately undermine sovereignty, that gaming would become powerful, and in response, the state would not only hit gaming, but break sovereignty too. This was his worry from the 90s. Vine Deloria, on the right side here, go back, the legendary philosopher, theologian, activist, imagine a non-materialist future. This is the same set of conversations where modern reservation communities, he wrote, are seen in the light of a century of development. It is clear, he argued, that Indians will move forward through the present difficulties to much better conditions as they simplify their lives by returning to cultural traditions. Again, these two arguments side by side. And of course, after that too, there is the specter of abuse and fraud and stereotyping, as when the infamous Jack Abramoff, a lobbyist, was caught in a scandal that implicated the Southern Cheyenne and Arapaho nations in shady payoffs described in shockingly racist terms. He called these people, his partners, troglodytes, morons, monkeys, his business partners, right? A very revealing moment. So what does this mean? Clearly the landscape has changed for Indian Nation. You go to the next slide. And in an Oklahoma reshaped by McGirt. Recall the governor and his supporters clearly perceived political benefit from bashing the tribes by scaring voters with what can be seen as a very Oklahoma version of the Great Replacement theory. On the other hand, what seems to be a replay of past battles masks an emerging set of dynamics. This is a consequence of gaming, to be sure, but also the intentional and sophisticated ways tribal nations have diversified their economic portfolios to become major players in the state's economy and governance, whether Stitt likes it or not. Moreover, the performance of tribal nations as responsible governments capable of managing complex enterprises speaks volumes, as does evidence of tribal nations building infrastructure for everyone, not just tribal citizens, a point the nations skillfully make and link with gaming dollars. They remind people of this. But as tribal nations build their economic capacity and influence, they are certain to face a reckoning. It's a truism that constituted power abhors competition. In the United States and maybe other settler colonial societies, the existence of and prospects for indigenous nationhood are particularly threatening given the legal and constitutional position of tribal nations themselves, of tribal sovereignty. Through history, the individual states have been hostile to tribal sovereignty and often are joined by extractive industries, ranching and farming interests, financial sectors that exert influence over policy and politics. Though the federal government is theoretically bound to shield the tribes, its record, McGirt notwithstanding, is not always encouraging. Sovereignty is both the tribe's strongest asset and most attractive target. Diminish it in one place, and you weaken it across the board. State and industry leaders led assaults on tribal sovereignty are well underway. As these slides indicate, Oklahoma has endorsed or led dozens of efforts to weaken or overturn McGirt itself. Most have failed. But in 2022, the U.S. Supreme Court in Oklahoma versus Castro Huerta endorsed the state's position that it has jurisdiction of crimes committed in Indian country when the defendant is the accused is a non-Indian. This shift earned a stinging dissent from Justice Gorsuch, the author of McGirt, who said, "Truly, a more ahistorical and mistaken statement of Indian law would be hard to fathom." He said, "Tribes are not private organizations within state boundaries. Their reservations are not glorified private campgrounds. Tribes are sovereign." Last thing, a far more threatening assault on sovereignty comes from a seemingly unrelated space. Next slide. In its most recent term, the Supreme Court heard arguments in Holland versus Brackeen. At issue is the 1978 Indian Child Welfare Act, a landmark law designed to address abuses of adoption laws that led to the placement of thousands of Native children with non-Native families. ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, rests on the proposition that communities have a stake in the welfare of the children who are part of the survival of their cultures. It also followed settled constitutional precedent defining membership in tribal communities as a political rather than a racial designation, meaning that citizenship is a function of tribal sovereignty. Plaintiffs in this case, actually there were several that grouped together under this one, argue the opposite. They argued that tribal membership is a racial category, and with that, the Indian Child Welfare Act is an unlawful and unconstitutional racial preference that injures those seeking to adopt Native children because it is racially discriminatory. It's important to note that this complaint is supported by interest groups with a history of litigating tribal sovereignty as it applies most specifically to tribal control of natural resources. Oil and gas companies are largely behind this. Well-heeled opponents of tribal gaming enterprises. This has led indigenous lawyers and activists to conclude that the real target is sovereignty, with the fate of adoption as a decidedly secondary issue. A clever stalking horse to encourage the court to diminish sovereignty. As we await the ruling, I actually invite you to listen to this excellent podcast that I've noted here, written and produced by Rebecca Nagel, available through This Land Podcast. And she also has a great one on the McGirt decision, by the way. So this is really, really wonderful stuff. If you like podcasts, really, really good. And so this is great. Let's skip to the end here. So, oh yes, one thing. Yep. No, we're going to stop right now. So I want to suggest a simple proposition to end this. How about when we wonder about and think about tribes and economic development and tribal capitalism and business, how about we ask tribal citizens and governments what they think? How they assess economic development, how they assess sovereignty and capitalism, the survival of indigenous communities. Tribal people live in this world, not an imaginary one. Having battled forces bent upon their destruction as distinctive cultures and communities and peoples and nations, they are keenly aware of the multiple trade-offs that required building sustainable economies, while also recognizing and holding fast to tribal nationhood as distinctive and indigenous, where they participate in economies as laborers, but in ways, and business owners, but in ways that respect their agency, their capacity to balance prosperity with nurturing and protecting cultural values and distinctiveness. And in our world, today, tribal enterprise, including the profits and human capacity it generates, provides the foundation for broader political influence. With that, I thank you.